Good evening, my dear students. Currently we are discussing the body fluids and circulation chapter, and today one of my student asks to explain the process of glycolysis. So I thought of explaining the process of glycolysis in between this particular chapter, right? So what is glycolysis? Glycolysis, it is the first step of aerobic and anaerobic respiration. First step of aerobic and anaerobic respiration. I hope that you are well known about the respiration, right? But let me explain in a very brief way that respiration, what is respiration? It is the process of breakdown of respiratory substrate to produce energy. So respiration is the process of breakdown of respiratory substrate to produce energy. This is the definition of respiration. Now, what is respiratory substrate? We know that after our food gets assimilated in our body, it gets utilized in different way. Say for example, let's talk about the glucose. So the glucose that gets absorbed by our body, it gets utilized, right, or it gets oxidized to produce energy, right? If glucose is not available, then fats will be utilized to generate energy or to generate ATP. If fats is also not available, then proteins will be utilized or proteins will be oxidized to liberate energy. The same with the case in case of plants also. So the plants, it produces the glucose. We know that the carbohydrate in the plants is produces glucose, right? So that glucose will be utilized by the plants to produce energy, right? Because each and every individual needs energy for all its metabolic activities, right? So to produce energy, it can the process is the respiration, and this respiration, that breakdown will be taking place in the presence or absence of oxygen. Based on that, respiration is of two types. The first is the aerobic respiration. So if the respiration is taking place in the presence of oxygen, then it will be called as what? Aerobic. It is presence of oxygen. And if the respiration is not taking place in the presence of oxygen, or if the respiration is taking place in the absence of oxygen, then it will be called as the anaerobic respiration. You know that in case of yeast or in case of the muscle cells, the respiration is the anaerobic respiration, right? Okay, so it is in the absence of oxygen. Right? Now, whatever it may be aerobic or it may be anaerobic respiration, it is not completed in a single step. This aerobic respiration or the anaerobic respiration is a multi-step process, right? That means the aerobic respiration is also completed in many steps. Anaerobic respiration is also completed in many steps, right? So if I talk about the aerobic respiration steps, then it is completed in steps like glycolysis. So these are the steps of aerobic respiration. Steps: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, then ETC or the electron transport chain, and oxidative phosphorylation. So these are the steps of aerobic respiration. That means after going through all these steps, it will be generating the ATP, right? And this anaerobic respiration will be also completed in steps like glycolysis. The first step is glycolysis. So you can see that the glycolysis step is common both for aerobic as well as the anaerobic respiration, right? So I think now you have a clear-cut idea about the glycolysis, the basic of glycolysis and the respiration, right? So now we'll discuss the glycolysis process in details. Okay, so glycolysis. So this glycolysis step, what is the location? First of all, let's see where the glycolysis process will take place. The location where the glycolysis process will take place is that in a cell, this glycolysis process will be taking place in the cytoplasm or in the matrix of the cell. So this glycolysis process will be taking place in the cytoplasm, and this glycolysis process is also called as EMP pathway. Okay, it is also called as EMP pathway. Why it is called as EMP pathway? Because this glycolysis, it is explained by three German scientists. Okay, it is explained by three German scientists, that is Emden, Meyerhoff, and Parnas. That is why it is called as this EMP pathway. And one more important thing is that this glycolysis is an anaerobic pathway. Anaerobic pathway, that means no oxygen, or oxygen is not required in this particular step. Okay, now let's see what are the these events that will be taking place in the glycolysis. So if you see the basic, or if you see the glycolysis in a very brief way, then glycolysis, what will happen in glycolysis, that glucose, that is the respiratory substrate. We are considering that the respiratory substrate is glucose. It may be proteins also, or it may be fats also, right? But let's consider the respiratory substrate is glucose. Then this glucose, we know that the glucose, the formula is C6H12O6. It is a hexose sugar, and it is also an polyhydroxy aldose sugar, right? It is an aldose sugar. We also call why we call it as aldose sugar, because the aldehyde group is present in the glucose molecule, and it is 6 carbon sugar. That is why we call it as a hexose sugar. So what happens in glucose, what happens with glucose in the process of glycolysis? Glucose, which is a 6 carbon compound, it gets broken down into what? 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, right? And one pyruvic acid molecule is having 3 carbon. That means it breaks down into 3 carbon compounds. There is 2 molecules of 3 carbon compounds, right? That means one glucose molecule, it gets broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, and one molecule of pyruvic acid is having 3 carbon, right? That means total 6 carbon, right? And this step is the glycolysis. Okay, and it takes place in cytoplasm. So this is a, you can say, the one step explanation of glycolysis. That if I explain the whole process of glycolysis in a single step, then in the glycolysis step, what will happen, that glucose will break down into 2 pyruvic acid, and it takes place in the cytoplasm, right? But it is not a single step process. There will be many, okay, there will be many events that will be happening in between this single step, right? Now let's discuss it in details. Okay, I'll start from here. Now let's discuss in a different pace. Okay, now glucose.